Power had done everything it knew how to do. It had confiscated land. It had imprisoned a man. It had issued commands that once moved armies. And still nothing changed. By the winter of 1297, the Crown of England faced a problem it could not threaten away: a marriage recognized by law, a child that could not be unborn, a daughter who refused to step forward or back. This is the moment history rarely shows, the pause after force fails. Because when authority cannot advance, it must either break the law that gives it meaning, or submit to the law it claims to command. A man without rank will speak in a room built for silence. And a king who never lost a war will discover that obedience, once withdrawn, does not return on command. This is not the fall of a crown. It is something far more dangerous. The moment the crown learns it can be made to wait. Power doesn't ask for permission. It moves quietly, decides quickly, and leaves consequences behind. What you're about to hear is not legend. It is history told without illusion. This is a historical power story. The court assembled expecting direction. What it received instead was hesitation. By early 1298, Edward I had reached the edge of force. Every measure available to him had already been used. To go further meant stepping outside the law he ruled through, and everyone present understood what that would signal. The problem was no longer Joan. It was a procedure. Clerks laid out records with careful hands, dates, witnesses, dispensations. The marriage existed in ink as much as in flesh. Canon law did not bend to anger, and annulment required grounds no one could invent without exposing fraud. The church had not defended Joan openly, but it had not opposed her either. That silence was decisive. Edward listened, jaw set, saying nothing. He had expected an argument, resistance, some point of leverage he could seize and turn. Instead, he was presented with structure, a structure that did not care who he was. Joan did not attend. Her absence was deliberate. Presence would have turned law into spectacle. She allowed the law to speak without her. Advisors began to argue among themselves, quietly at first, then with urgency. Every option carried consequences. To declare the marriage void risked clerical revolt. To hold Ralph indefinitely risked noble unrest. To yield risked precedent. Edward understood this language well. He had used it against others. Now it was being used against him. The realization settled heavily. The law was no longer moving toward his will. It was waiting. And whoever moved next would reveal whether England was ruled by command or by consent. The silence broke in a way no one expected. Not with a decree, but with a question, asked too plainly to be dismissed. A clerk, reading aloud from canon summaries in 1298, paused and looked up. If the marriage was lawful, on what grounds was the husband confined? If it was unlawful, why had annulment not been pursued? No one answered at once. Edward's advisors exchanged looks that revealed calculation, not confusion. The problem was not the question. The problem was that any answer would expose a weakness. To admit error was to concede authority. To deny legality was to challenge the church. To continue punishment was to invite scrutiny. The king listened, unmoving. For years he had ruled by momentum. Here, momentum had stalled. Each path forward carried risk he could not absorb without loss. And the longer the question hung unanswered, the more it spread, moving from clerks to courtiers, from courtiers to nobles who understood precedent when they saw one forming. Outside the chamber, the story changed shape. It was no longer about a disobedient daughter. It was about law applied selectively, about power acting first and justifying later. That story did not favor crowns. Ralph remained imprisoned. That fact alone sharpened the dilemma. Punishment without resolution suggested fear. Fear, once sensed, traveled quickly. Edward dismissed the assembly without decision. The court dispersed, carrying uncertainty instead of orders. In corridors and chapels, the same question repeated, softer each time but more dangerous for it. If authority could not explain itself, what exactly was it enforcing? The answer would not come from the king. It would come from the man he had locked away. Ralph de Monthermer had been silent for months. His imprisonment in 1297 was meant to erase him, to reduce a problem to absence. But absence had failed. By 1298, the court needed something it had not planned for: resolution. And resolution required a voice. He was brought before officials without ceremony. No audience, no sympathy, just questions shaped to corner him into an apology. They expected humility. They expected fear. What they received was clarity. Ralph did not deny his status. He did not defend his worth. He acknowledged exactly who he was and refused to accept that it mattered. When asked why he had presumed to marry a king's daughter, he answered with a calm that unsettled the room. No one, he said, thought it disgraceful when a great lord married a poor woman. Why, then, should it be shameful when a great lady married a poor man? The question did not accuse. It was exposed. It stripped the hierarchy of justification and left only custom standing in its place. Custom, once named, proved fragile. The officials heard it immediately. So did the clerks recording every word. This was not defiance. It was logical. Word of the exchange spread faster than any proclamation. Nobles repeated it privately. Clerics weighed it carefully. The question did not challenge the king directly. It challenged the structure that protected him. Ralph was returned to confinement, but the damage was done. He had spoken once, and that was enough. Because a question, once answered honestly, cannot be unasked. And now the crown had to decide whether it ruled by tradition or by reason. The court could not contain the question once it escaped the room. By late 1298, it circulated carefully, stripped of names, sharpened by repetition. Why was one marriage shameful and the other honorable? Why did law bow to rank when rank ignored law? Each retelling moved it farther from Ralph and closer to the crown. Edward felt the shift in small ways. Advisors hedged, clerics delayed. Nobles asked for clarification before offering support. No one accused him openly. They did something worse. They waited. The church's silence hardened into position. No condemnation arrived. No annulment was proposed. Canonists spoke instead of validity and consent, of marriages entered freely and therefore bound. Each phrase closed another door the king might have used. Joan remained absent. That absence mattered. Without her presence, the dispute could not be framed as emotion or disobedience. It remained procedural, cold, exactly. Edward considered escalation. Confiscation could be made permanent. Imprisonment could be extended. But punishment without end now looked less like authority and more like uncertainty. The longer Ralph remained confined, the stronger the question grew. By winter, messages reached the king suggesting release, not as mercy but as repair. Release would not concede defeat, they said. It would restore balance. Edward understood the truth beneath the advice. Balance favored the law. He delayed. Hopping time would dull the issue. It did the opposite. Pressure, once redirected, does not disappear. It gathers quietly toward the throne. By early 1299, Edward understood the position he now occupied. It was not defiance he faced, it was a consequence. Every delay tightened the knot. The law did not accuse him, but it no longer shielded him either. Nobles who once would have followed without question now measured their responses. Clerics spoke carefully, but their care leaned in one direction. The structure of authority was still standing, yet it had begun to lean. Edward reviewed the situation as he would a campaign. Resources spent. Outcomes stalled. Morale is uncertain. He had broken stronger men than Ralph de Monthermer. Yet here, the prisoner remained dangerous precisely because he did nothing. The king considered one final option: to hold, to wait until exhaustion forced compliance. That strategy had worked against cities and armies. It failed against legitimacy. The longer Ralph remained confined, the clearer the contradiction became. Law recognized the marriage. The church acknowledged consent. The only unresolved element was the king's will, and will alone could not carry the weight anymore. Edward realized something then, quietly and without relief. If he continued, he would not be enforcing orders. He would be defending pride. And pride, unlike authority, could not be justified publicly. The decision approached not as surrender but as necessity. Something had to move, something had to give. Whether it would be the prisoner, the punishment, or the crown's posture itself was not yet clear. What was clear was this: the moment for choosing had arrived. And whichever choice Edward made next would be remembered, not as command but as admission. The order was issued without ceremony. In 1299, Ralph de Monthermer was released from confinement, not as concession, not as forgiveness, but as correction. The language mattered. Edward needed the record to show balance restored, not authority bent. A man freed could be explained. A king yielding could not. Ralph emerged thinner, quieter, unchanged. There was no procession, no reconciliation staged for witnesses. He returned to Joan without elevation, without apology, without instruction. The crown expected gratitude. Gratitude did not arrive. What followed unsettled the court far more than imprisonment ever had. Nothing changed. Joan did not rush to Westminster. She did not offer thanks. She did not renegotiate her place. The marriage remained as it had always been: lawful, private, final. By releasing Ralph without conditions, the crown had removed its last visible lever. Advisors noticed the shift immediately. Punishment had ended, yet submission had not begun. The king had acted, and still, obedience had not followed. That inversion lingered in every chamber where authority was discussed. Edward sensed it too. The release closed one problem and opened another. He had proven he could not hold indefinitely. He had also proven he would not escalate. Between those truths, a precedent formed. Ralph's freedom did not weaken the crown. It clarified its limits. Because the question no longer concerned imprisonment or property. It concerned something far more dangerous: whether authority required acknowledgement to function, or whether it could survive being quietly ignored. Joan and Ralph lived as they had chosen. The court adjusted around them, and in that adjustment a truth settled unspoken. Power had acted, and discovered it could not finish the act alone. Recognition followed release, not as reward but as inevitability. By mid-1299 the court completed what it had resisted nomming. Ralph de Monthermer was acknowledged publicly, not as a knight who had overreached, but as Joan's lawful husband. Titles were restored to him in her right, carefully worded to preserve hierarchy while conceding reality. Earl of Gloucester, Earl of Hertford. The ink was precise. The meaning was not. Edward did not announce the decision. Announcements suggested triumph. This was repaired. Ralph accepted the titles without ceremony. No oath beyond what law required. No display of gratitude. He understood, as Joan did, that excess emotion would cheapen what had been won. Acceptance, not celebration, was the final assertion. The court watched closely for signs of imbalance. A common man elevated too quickly could provoke resentment. None came. Ralph wore authority lightly. He deferred where custom demanded and stood firm where law allowed. His restraint reassured those who feared disruption. What unsettled them instead was Joan. She did not change. She did not posture as victor. She moved through court exactly as before, measured, composed, unannouncing. Power had expected reaction. It received continuity. That continuity carried its own warning. By recognizing the marriage fully, the crown had done more than restore titles. It had conceded that consent, once given, could outrank command. The acknowledgement did not rewrite the system, but it cracked it. And cracks invite inspection. As Joan and Ralph settled into a life the crown could no longer rearrange, observers began to ask a quieter question. If this precedent stood, what else might stand with it? The answer would unfold slowly, and authority would feel it long after the court moved on. The court adjusted, as courts always did, by pretending nothing essential had changed. By 1300, Joan and Ralph occupied their restored position without announcement or apology. They attended when required. They withdrew when finished. No declarations followed them. No faction formed around them. Their restraint denied the court the drama it expected. That restraint was the lesson. Power did not fracture loudly. It recalibrated. Advisors revised assumptions. Clerks noted language more carefully. The law was cited more often, not less. Authority, having been checked once, moved with new caution. Edward observed this from a distance. He did not punish further. He did not reward either. He allowed the outcome to settle as though it had always been inevitable. Kings survived by absorbing losses into continuity. Yet something had altered beneath that continuity. Joan was no longer approached as a daughter to be placed. She was approached as a position to be acknowledged. Decisions near her were phrased, not issued. Her silence carried expectation now, not submission. Ralph remained deliberately unremarkable. He spoke when asked. He did not press advantage. His power lay in being exactly where he was permitted, and nowhere else. That discipline reassured the court even as it unsettled the structure beneath it. Together, they demonstrated something authority disliked, but could not deny. The crown still ruled. The law is still bound. But obedience was no longer automatic. It had to be earned, or at least respected. And once power learns to share space with consent, it never fully recovers its old certainty. The court moved on. History did not. What followed did not feel like triumph. There were no celebrations, no gestures marking resolution. By 1301, the matter of Joan and Ralph had settled into the court's background, filed away as concluded. That was how authority preferred its losses, quiet, normalized, absorbed into routine. But silence after victory is never empty. Joan noticed the change first in how people waited for her response. Not approval, attention. Decisions paused slightly when she was present, as though her consent now needed to be inferred before action resumed. She had not asked for this. She did not acknowledge it. That made it stronger. Ralph felt it differently. Men who once overlooked him now measured their words, not with fear but with calculation. He remained the same, and that steadiness unsettled them. Power expects those it elevates to transform. Ralph did not. He behaved as though elevation had merely confirmed what already existed. Edward observed from afar. He did not revisit the conflict. Kings did not reopen resolved matters unless seeking revenge, and Edward was too disciplined for that. Still, something lingered. The knowledge that a boundary had been found, and that he had not been the one to draw it. The court continued, but with memory. It remembered that force had stalled. That law had been held. That silence had won. These memories did not announce themselves. They waited. And waiting, Joan had learned long ago, was never passive. It was preparation. By 1302, the court had returned to its rhythms, but not to its innocence. What Joan had done could not be undone, and more dangerously, it could not be forgotten. Her marriage was no longer discussed, yet it had redrawn an invisible boundary. Power had discovered a limit, and limits, once revealed, invited measurement. Nobles noticed it first. In small negotiations, in minor disputes, they tested how far royal will could stretch before law intervened. Clerks framed arguments more carefully. Priests chose words with greater precision. Nothing openly challenged the crown, everything adjusted around it. Edward sensed the change without nomming it. He remained king. Orders were obeyed, armies still moved, but the certainty that obedience would follow command without question had softened. Where it once rushed forward, it now paused. Joan did not exploit this. Exploitation would have drawn attention. She allowed the line to remain exactly where it was, visible only to those who looked closely enough. Her restraint preserved the lesson. Ralph continued his quiet role, refusing to become a symbol or spokesman. He understood that the power of their position lay not in repetition, but in precedent. The precedent did not need defending. It needed surviving. Together, they lived inside the boundary they had revealed, never crossing it again. That restraint made the line permanent. Because power could challenge rebellion. It could crush ambition. But it struggled to erase proof. And proof, once established, waits patiently for the next moment it will be needed. That moment was approaching, and it would arrive with finality. By 1305, the shift was undeniable, though never declared. Edward I was older now. Campaigns weighed heavier. Decisions arrived slower, filtered through councils that had learned caution. The king still commanded, but command no longer rushed ahead of consequence. Somewhere in the years since his daughter's defiance, authority had learned restraint. Joan observed this from a distance she never closed. She was no longer summoned as a problem to be solved. She was consulted as a condition to be considered. The difference was subtle but absolute. Power did not ask her to agree, it asked itself whether she already had. That change had not come from victory, it came from endurance. Edward did not revisit the conflict because he could not do so without reopening the wound it had left in his authority. Kings survived by choosing which memories to silence. This one was left untouched, not honored, not erased. Ralph remained unchanged. He neither expanded nor retreated. He understood something many powerful men never did, that holding ground mattered more than gaining it. His refusal to capitalize on favor preserved the outcome. Together, they represented something unsettling to the old order. Not rebellion, not reform, but proof. Proof that the crown could be resisted without violence. Proof that consent mattered even when unspoken. Proof that authority, once forced to retreat, never fully advanced the same way again. Edward ruled on. England endured. But beneath the surface, a lesson had taken root, quiet, permanent, and waiting for its final witness. That witness would arrive sooner than expected. By 1306, time itself became a presence. Edward I felt it first in his body, fatigue that no victory corrected, pain that no command dismissed. The court sensed it next. Decisions slowed. Succession entered conversations once reserved for conquest. Authority, still intact, began preparing for its own continuity. Joan watched this without satisfaction. She did not need the king to weaken for her story to matter. What she had done no longer depended on him. The precedent existed beyond any single reign. That knowledge steadied her as much as it unsettled the court. Ralph noticed how people now spoke of process, where they once spoke of orders. Language shifted before power ever admitted change. Men who remembered the crisis of 1297 now measured their steps instinctively, as though law itself had learned to stand straighter. Edward did not summon his daughter. He did not reconcile formally. He did not reopen old arguments. Silence became the only safe posture. To acknowledge the conflict now would be to confess its lesson. That lesson lingered, unresolved but complete. As the king's health declined, advisors began speaking more openly of the future. A new reign would arrive soon. New authority, new momentum. Some wondered privately whether old limits would be tested again. Joan understood what they did not. Limits revealed once do not vanish with the ruler who discovered them. They wait. Edward I was still alive, still crowned, still commanding. Yet something irreversible approached, not collapse but conclusion. The kind history marks quietly, with dates rather than declarations. The end of a reign was coming, and with it, the final measure of what Joan's defiance had truly changed. In early 1307, the court began to speak in careful verbs. Edward I was still king, still issuing orders, but the machinery around him moved with a different awareness. Messages were drafted with contingencies. Decisions were recorded with unusual precision. Power, sensing its own limit, tried to make itself legible before it passed on. Joan felt the change as distance closed. She was not summoned, yet she was considered. Not invited, yet accounted for. Her name appeared in documents where it once would not have. The court had learned to acknowledge without conceding, and that lesson had been expensive. Ralph remained beside her, unchanged in posture and ambition. If he sensed an opportunity, he did not take it. He understood that endings required restraint. To press now would cheapen what had been achieved. Better to let the structure complete its own correction. Edward's health worsened. Campaign plans dissolved into logistics. The future narrowed. The king who had bent kingdoms could no longer bend time. He did not revisit old conflicts. He did not seek absolution. He left certain matters where they lay, untouched. Joan understood the significance. Some victories are measured not by reversal, but by survival. What she had secured did not depend on his approval now. It existed beyond him. As winter receded, word spread that the king's strength was failing. England prepared quietly for transition. Joan waited, as she always had, not for permission but for inevitability. The moment approached when authority would change hands. And with it, judgment would no longer be deferred. Edward I died in July 1307, on campaign in the north, still wearing the weight of command. The news reached the court without spectacle. Bells rang, banners shifted. England did what it always did when a king ended, mourned formally and moved immediately. Authority transferred itself with practiced speed. Joan did not attend the center of mourning. She did not need to. Her story no longer required the king who had tried to contain it. What mattered now was what remained unchanged after him. With Edward's death, something settled permanently. There would be no reckoning, no reversal, no correction disguised as legacy. The marriage stood, the title stood, the precedent stood. A new king inherited not only a crown but a boundary his father had discovered too late to erase. Ralph felt the shift immediately. Men spoke more freely around him now, not because they respected him more, but because the danger had passed. The conflict belonged to history. Its lesson belonged to the present. Joan understood this moment clearly. Edward had been the last authority who could have undone what she had done. His strength, his will, his fearlessness, none of it had been enough. And now time itself has closed the argument. Power could not appeal to the dead. It could only live with what survived them. Joan did not celebrate. She did not grieve publicly either. She stood where she had always stood, inside the outcome she had chosen, watching the world adjust around it. The crown endured. But it endured. And that change would outlive them all. After the king's death in 1307, England searched itself for instability and found none. That was the final proof. The crown passed smoothly to a new ruler, courts reopened, campaigns resumed, laws were enforced, nothing collapsed, nothing rebelled, and yet something had undeniably changed, something quiet enough to survive transition. Joan watched the new reign begin without interference. She was no longer a question. She was a condition already accounted for. Her marriage was not debated. Her position was not renegotiated. It simply existed, settled into the structure as though it had always belonged there. That permanence mattered. Ralph understood it too. He did not expand his reach. He did not claim influence beyond what law allowed. He remained exactly where precedent had placed him. In doing so, he protected the lesson from being challenged. The court learned to live with what it could not undo. Clerks cited the case carefully. Nobles remembered it selectively. Authority absorbed it the way it absorbed all inconvenient truths, by moving forward without comment. Joan felt no triumph in this. Triumph demanded recognition. She had never needed that. What she had secured was more durable. She had proven that power could be resisted without spectacle, that obedience was not automatic, that consent, once withheld lawfully, altered the shape of command itself. Nothing else was required. History does not always announce its turning points. Sometimes it allows them to settle, quietly, into normalcy. And when that happens, reversal becomes impossible. What remained after power passed was not rebellion. It was proof. And proof does not fade. The years after 1307 did not announce themselves. Joan lived without spectacle, and that, too, was deliberate. Power had already been confronted. There was no need to remind them. She managed her estates, raised her children, and moved through England as someone no longer subject to rearrangement. The court treated her with a caution that bordered on respect. Nothing in her daily life suggested defiance. That was the point. Ralph remained at her side, steady and unremarkable. He did not attempt to convert precedent into advantage. He understood that the strength of their position lay in how ordinary it appeared. Extraordinary claims invited challenges. Ordinary reality endured. The new reign brought new priorities: war, finance, succession. Joan was not useful to those concerns, and so she was left alone. In that solitude, the lesson she had carved into the system was allowed to harden. She noticed how disputes near her estates were handled more carefully, how clerks referenced law first, not command. These were small shifts, barely visible but cumulative. Authority learned from survival more than from theory. Joan never recorded her version of events. She did not need to. Her life itself had become a record. She had moved through power without breaking it, and in doing so had proven it could bend. What unsettled later observers was not what she did, but what she refused to do afterward. She did not claim the role of example. She simply lived as though choice had always belonged to her. That quiet normalcy was her final argument, and it was stronger than any proclamation could ever be. Joan's health began to fail quietly, the way her power had once grown. By early 1307, before the year had fully turned, those closest to her noticed fatigue that rest did not correct. She moved more slowly. Her silences lengthened. No announcement followed. No alarm was raised. In noble households, decline was treated as inconvenience until it became unavoidable. Joan did not dramatize it. She continued to oversee her affairs, to receive reports, to decide what still required her attention and what could be released. Control, she understood, did not mean holding everything forever. It meant knowing when to let go without surrender. Illness strips people of illusion. Joan had none left to lose. She did not seek reconciliation. She did not revisit old conflicts. The crown no longer hovered over her life, and she did not invite it back in memory. What she had done stood complete, independent of her endurance. Ralph remained constant. He did not press her to rest. He did not deny what was happening. He adjusted quietly the way he always had. Presence mattered more than reassurance now. When word spread that her condition worsened, the court reacted with restraint. No inquiries, no interventions. Joan was not a problem to be solved. She was an outcome already accepted. As her strength waned, something else remained firm. The law she had trusted did not retreat. The choice she had made did not weaken. Her body might falter, but the structure she had altered would not. And that difference mattered more than survival ever could. As strength faded, Joan made one final decision herself. She chose Clare Priory. It was not the grandest house available to her, nor the most politically useful. That was precisely why it mattered. Clare was orderly, not spectacle, prayer, not performance, a place where memory would be kept quietly, without argument. By the spring of 1307, arrangements were made without urgency. No summons went out. No court gathered. Joan understood that death, like power, did not require an audience to be final. Those around her expected confession, reflection, some final explanation of the life she had lived. She offered none. Explanation invited debate. Debate invited reduction. Joan had never allowed either. What mattered had already been done. She spent her remaining days as she had spent her strongest ones, deciding what required her presence and withdrawing from the rest. She gave instructions for her children. She resolved accounts. She released obligations carefully, the way one closes doors without slamming them. Ralph remained near, not as guardian, not as symbol, but as constant. The world beyond the priory continued. The court moved on. Authority shifted its attention elsewhere. That too was proof. When Joan died later that year, it did not interrupt the kingdom. No crisis followed. No correction arrived. Her absence changed nothing about what she had secured. Yet something unsettled those who recorded her burial. Because when her tomb was opened years later, witnesses claimed her body had not decayed. They called it a sign. Others called it coincidence. History, indifferent, kept the details and waited for judgment. The chroniclers hesitated. Joan of Acre's death in 1307 did not fit the language prepared for it. She had not rebelled. She had not repented. She had not been punished. She had simply lived and altered the ground beneath authority without ever declaring intent. So the records softened her. They called her dutiful. They emphasized her lineage. They listed her marriages as facts rather than fractures. When they mentioned Ralph, it was with restraint, as though proximity itself might revive controversy. History prefers clarity. Joan had left none. Yet details survived despite intention. The imprisonment. The restoration. The titles granted unwillingly. The king who delayed where he never had before. And the body. When Clare Priory opened her tomb years later, witnesses recorded something they did not know how to frame. Her remains, they said, showed little decay. In an age that searched for meaning in flesh, this unsettled them. Some whispered sanctity, others warned restraint. The church never pursued canonization. Silence was safer. Still, the detail persisted. It was easier to believe in a miracle than to confront the possibility that authority itself had been corrected. Easier to attribute power to the divine than to acknowledge consent as force. Ralph outlived her by years, fading from prominence without resistance. He did not defend her legacy. He did not interpret it. He allowed it to stand exactly as it was, unaltered by explanation. History moved on, but it did not erase her. Because systems remember what challenges them successfully. Even when names soften. Even when motives blur. The structure had changed. And it would never admit why. History did not accuse Edward I. It did not need to. His reign remained formidable. His conquests stood. His laws endured. Yet threaded through the record was a pause that could not be edited out. A moment when authority reached forward and found resistance not in arms, but in lawfully withheld consent. Joan of Acre left no manifesto, no declaration, no demand for remembrance. That restraint confused those who came after. Revolt was easy to name. Reform could be catalogued. What she had done resisted classification. She had not overthrown power. She had exposed its dependency. Power requires agreement, not always loud, not always willing, but present. And when that agreement is withdrawn carefully, legally, without spectacle, power falters without knowing how to respond. Edward had been forced to wait. That was the judgment. Not humiliation. Not defeat. Delay. And delay in the life of authority is irreversible. Ralph de Monthermer vanished into the margins of history as he had lived. Joan's children inherited lands, not controversy. England continued, but something in the structure remained altered, subtle, permanent, unacknowledged. Joan of Acre was not canonized. She was not condemned. She was absorbed. That absorption was her final victory. Because history does not only remember those who break systems, it remembers those who prove systems can be made to hesitate and survive the proof. History often teaches power through collapse, crowns shattered, wars lost, thrones overturned. Joan of Acre offers a rarer lesson. She did not destroy authority, she exposed its dependency. She showed that power does not live in commands alone. It lives in acceptance, in recognition, in the quiet agreement that allows orders to move forward without resistance. When that agreement is withdrawn carefully, lawfully, patiently, without spectacle, power does not know how to respond. Edward, I did not fall. The crown did not crack. The kingdom did not tremble. But the crown waited. That pause mattered more than defeat ever could. It proved that authority could be delayed without violence, corrected without rebellion, and survived without submission. Joan's victory was not loud enough to provoke erasure, nor dramatic enough to invite reversal. It settled into the system and stayed. She left no doctrine behind, no movement, no followers, only precedent. And precedent is the most dangerous inheritance of all. Because systems forget rebellions. They study revolutions. But they quietly adjust to proof. Joan of Acre became that proof. Not because she fought power, but because she showed power what happens when consent, once withdrawn, does not return. That is why her story endures. Not as scandalous, not romance, but as judgment. Power always moves on. History decides who mattered. History rarely rewards the people who change it. This is a historical power story. If this story made you pause, there are more like it on the channel. New historical power stories are added regularly.